Welcome to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast, you just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do, probably, because, well, that's more than 1 year of DejaVue in episode 54. And as you might see and hear in a second, it's a special one. Michael, what do we have here?
Yeah, we have a bunch of people here, not just one guest, but we've got 3 guests. We're doing a panel on open source sustainability. So that's going to be a fun discussion to get into.
Absolutely. And probably you've already added in the title, like, hey, that's a good topic. But who do we have here? Well, to join us in the panel, to indulge us in like nice discussions, maybe a little feud coming up. No, of course, that's not the case. Rijk and Daniel, they won't get into that. And yeah, please, let's do it from left to right. Whoever wants to go first, introduce yourself. Who are you on here? Maybe a bit about like your involvement in open source and what you're up to.
Left to right on whose screen?
It doesn't matter.
Alphabetical order.
Oh gosh, Daniel, you were
I see
starting to go. Go
myself
ahead.
as on the left. That's my.
You're on my left. Yeah, same here. Go
Okay,
for it.
so maybe I am just canonically on the left. My name is Daniel. I am an open source developer, a full-time open source developer. I lead the team building Nuxt, which has some other people on the team as well, including Alex here, and some other amazing folk as well. And before that, I had a small software as a service startup. I had a creative agency before that. And then before that, I did totally different things. I was a church leader, studied law, lots of stuff in the background. But yeah, that's me.
Am I canonically next?
You are.
All right, my name is Chad Whitacre. I'm head of open source at Sentry. I've been at Sentry for a little over 4 years, leading initiatives in open source sustainability from a company side, trying to fund open source maintainers. And we launched something about 6 months ago called the Open Source Pledge, where we're trying to get other companies to join us in paying the maintainers. But my background, is in web development, going back into the Python web framework wars of the aughts that gave rise to Django and Flask and whatnot. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth in Python community, web development, going back a ways, and landed here at Sentry.
Sweet.
Awesome. And then last but not least, I'm Rijk van Zanten, the CTO and co-founder of Directus, also an open source developer. That project has gone through some iterations in trying to make it sustainable as an open source project. So we turned it into a company to make the thing sustainable long term. My background is in user experience design originally, and then rolled into agency work as a more of a software developer, full stack type of person, do a little bit of everything, and then into this. Yeah.
Here we are. And these are our wonderful 3 panelists, including Michael. Michael, who is a wonderful full-time educator around the Vue Nuxt ecosystem. So, co-host of this podcast, obviously, as well. And bringing out the new content as well as his new edition of Mastering Nuxt launched recently. So definitely check it out if you're into Nuxt or want to be.
Yeah, and my co-host Alex here is, as Daniel mentioned, part of the Nuxt core team. And recently DevRel at Void Zero, so that's pretty awesome, and so you'll be seeing more of him on the internet for sure.
Yeah, hopefully hopefully more than before even.
Alex, congrats on that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, thanks.
That's awesome, man. Yeah,
thank you so much. Go ahead.
Speaking of open source sustainability, it's a real move towards open source sustainability, right? When companies like Void Zero are able to employ people like Alex who work and build open source software. So.
True that. Good points. And that's actually a good point. We talk a lot about open source sustainable already, at least the term. And maybe let's start with what it actually means. And more importantly, why is it even important? Why do we need that in a way? Let's start maybe with Daniel here. Yeah, perfect.
This is the point where we try and bring out that famous XKCD cartoon with all of the internet's infrastructure resting on that one open source project maintained by a single person somewhere in some remote place.
Nebraska, Daniel. Come on, Nebraska.
Nebraska, exactly.
Those Nebraska projects. Yeah. I was talking to somebody the other day. Who was it? Oh, yeah. Are you all aware of this open source endowment that's getting started? It's pretty under the radar. This might be one of the first I don't know if I'm breaking some news here, but there's an open source endowment that's getting started. Anyway, in one of the Hacker News posts, kind of leading up to this, somebody came out, was like, I'm the person, I've been maintaining this project for 20 years and I live in Nebraska or whatever. We're like, oh, it's real. This person's real. Yeah, we got to track them down.
Amazing.
Yeah, I have a pretty specific definition of open source sustainability. If that's kind of what we're leading with here is definitions. I distinguish between sustainability and what I call subsidization. Okay. So sustaining versus subsidizing. And it really comes from kind of an analysis of the economics of open source, because the economics of open source kind of by definition, these are the rabbit holes. We can see what threads we want to pull on here, but kind of puts itself outside of what we'd call the market economy. It's part of the definition of open source. The code is freely distributable, free as in cost, as well as free as in speech, free as in beer, and free as in speech. Okay. So open source is sort of like shooting itself in the foot. Is the strength is the weakness. The reason we all love it and use it, and the reason that it's so successful, is because it's so easy to adopt, because you don't have to pay for it. But that kind of, paints us into a corner where it's like, oh crap, I kind of want to get paid for this, right? Like, but I can't, I can't use kind of the traditional ways to do that. So I think of open source sustainability as when maintainers are paid fairly without having to jump through hoops. So obviously some things to debate in there, but sustainability is that. And then I think of subsidization as jumping through hoops. It's like, okay, I can, I can get paid fairly for my work, but I have to go get a job at a company and I have to work some on what the company wants me to work on. And I only get to work half-time on my open source project or whatever, right? Or, I'm going to be a YouTube creator and I'm going to create educational content. It's like, well, that's the thing that I'm selling. And, I get to do the open source over here. So any kind of business model that's adjacent to open source, I think of that as subsidizing open source. But I really want to use that term sustainability. The way that I use it is when maintainers are getting paid fairly without having to jump through hoops. That's my salvo.
Yeah.
Put that one in the hopper.
I'm not sure how much I agree with that.
Okay. Well, that makes for a great podcast episode.
Exactly. So we're not just saying what he said all the time. So, I mean, the thing that my niggle, and maybe you're going to you've already thought of these things, but like my niggle is, it seems to. So, I mean, the jumping through hoops is basically saying how much friction is there, I guess. For sustainability, but the example, and like I understand that, and maybe would go more in that direction than I would. So I don't like the term subsidization as opposed to sustainability, because the idea of subsidization is that effectively something else is paying for the open source. So in other words, and this, I might be getting this wrong, but the idea, for example, if you're employed by a company and then you work on open source in your spare time, it's like you are subsidizing open source with something else that you're doing, like working for the company. Or the idea, if you're doing content, you're subsidizing your open source work by that. But in my mind, both of those are really valid ways for open source to be sustainable, because I would say the question is, on a holistic level, is this something that can keep going? So I think sustainability is about the ability to keep going. And if something is about hoops and friction, that is something that's going to make it not be a sustainable choice, because it's going to slow it down. It's going to stop it from going. But you can have a scenario, for example, where someone creates an open source project, people use that project, they want to understand how to use it better, they buy courses produced by that person. And to me, that doesn't sound like subsidization. That sounds like sustainability, because it's about a system that is workable and keeps going. And maybe you would agree with me. I don't know. I might be misunderstanding.
But the subsidization leads to sustainability, then, is the prompt, right?
Exactly.
Well, I think what I hear you saying is there's a distinction between maybe the individual maintainer and then the project. And so if we're talking about the project, is the project that system that keeps going, that system that goes into the future, whether a particular maintainer is part of it or not, comes or goes, or whatever an individual maintainer's relationship to it or situation is. Is that a distinction that's in kind of what you're saying there?
I don't see that as a distinction. I just see that as a matter of scale. So if, for example, I'm looking at a project that has several maintainers, or like whether maintainers are involved in that, and I think of that as an ecosystem. So you might have some developers who are being sustained in some ways and have their own patterns, just as you have people who bring their own contributions, because people aren't even contributing in the same way. So that idea that they might have a sustainable relationship with a project in different ways makes sense too.
Okay, we got to get more specific here. Forgive me. So, Daniel, what's your relationship? And you're on the Nuxt core team. What's your own? Who employs you?
I'm not employed.
Okay.
So I am sponsored by a number of people and companies. I have I've received money
Probably
from
Sentry.
Sentry.
Good. Yeah. Okay.
But I would say that by far the most significant contributor is Nuxt Labs, which is a company that was created by the original founder of Nuxt.
Yeah. Okay. So you're living the dream. So you are an independent. Yeah. Okay. So you're an independent maintainer, and you're sponsored by companies.
Yes.
Primarily, and probably some individuals in there too.
And I think in a project, though, there's space for people having different relationships with that project. Whether some of them are sponsored, some are giving free time, some of them are consultants. Maybe people hire them because of their expertise in the project. Some of them are maybe producing educational content, like wildly successful podcasts, which bring in millions. Obviously, I'm setting the dream for DejaVue there. I'm not sure if you're there yet, but
getting there, folks.
Yes.
It feels like these are all valid pieces of an ecosystem.
So let me be clear. Subsidization, I don't think is invalid. I think it's fine to have that. I guess Jacob Kaplan-Moss wrote a post a year ago or something where he kind of went on this rant. It was like, look, it's all fine. Let's not shame people for how they get paid and how they kind of negotiate their own relationship with their open source work and their paid work. And so all of the options are good. Okay. I think that's where I would want to kind of connect with you there. And yet, and this is where I'm curious to hear more about your situation, some of your story, the idea of an independent maintainer who's able to provide value to the world by creating open source software. I think of it, I'm gonna bring this out. Y'all ready for this? Yin's ready for this, to use the Pittsburghese. Open source is a gift economy. Okay. It's not a market economy. It's a gift economy. What does that mean? In a market economy, we have clean transactions where, I showed the robot, my phone, and it lets me walk away with the M&Ms. And there's no relationship between me and the robot after that. Okay. In a gift economy, I offer a gift. And when you accept that gift, it comes with an obligation, or at least an invitation, or some kind of expectation that you're going to return the gift in the future. So if we go out to eat together, if the five of us go out to eat together, right? And at the end, it's like, who's going to pay the check is the question. It's more of like you go out with a friend, right? It's like Daniel, if you and I go out to eat together, and, at the end of the meal, it's like we both pull out our phones and, have this like little tug of war for who's going to take the check. And I let you take the check. What am I going to say at the end of that, right? I say, I'll get it next time. Okay. Right. And so we walk away from that exchange of value, the gift of the meal. We walk away from that with a relationship, with an obligation or an invitation or a connection that lasts in the future. That's how I think of open source.
Although today it just super isn't.
Open source?
It feels like, to me, from my perspective,
it's a bad gift economy. It's a disorganized gift economy. That's how I see it.
For the gift giver, it's the gift economy, but for the gift receiver, they treat it as a just regular market economy, and then you end up in this weird sort of one-sided,
Yes.
So, the thing is, as you were saying that, I was like, yes, until you explained what you meant by what a gift economy was, because I totally think open source is a gift economy.
Okay.
But
meaning what?
I think that definition turns a gift economy into a market economy. It just makes implicit assumptions about how the payback is going to happen. I think a gift economy And that is why I do open source, and it is what I believe very firmly in. I believe I'm giving, but the whole essence for me of what giving is that there is no expectation of return.
Yeah.
So I don't expect that someone is going to give back. Now, and partly I think not only is that I think what giving is, but also I think it's essential for sustainability in terms of, because I think one of the things we don't talk about often in sustainability is the role of our own mental health and mental well-being. Because sustainability isn't a money question. Sustainability is a holistic question. So you can have someone who's getting paid loads. They've got lots of money, but they're stressed, they're burnt out, they can't keep going. The question isn't how do we get, well, I mean, obviously we want more money in open source, but the reason we want more money in open source is not just because of the value of it, but because it enables people to keep going. It enables them to find meaning in what they're doing.
It's a means to an end.
Yeah. And I think when you have an expectation of return, I'm giving, and now I think, as you were saying, Rijk, I think now that I've given, that there's an implicit expectation that you will give back, and then you don't. That produces frustration, it produces bitterness, and it produces burnout. Now, the thing is, if I give and I have no expectation that you'll give back, which honestly, Chad, if I give you something or if I pay for dinner at a restaurant, I don't actually expect you to do it. And that means when you do pay the next time, I feel a sense of joy that is life-giving to me. Whereas if I had an expectation the first time round, then I would, one, feel a sense of frustration if you didn't. And two, when you did, I'd be like, okay, well, now the thing that I was expecting has happened. Can I say, I want to live in a world of joy.
I love the door slam on that one. Yeah. Yeah. This is great. We're getting into it. Rijk, where are you coming from on this?
I don't really. I hope you understand. Like, totally. I'm totally on board. I hope this is a debate between people who are on this. I'd say friends. We've not met before,
100%.
but we're on the same side here, right?
Yeah, we're all friends, and we're all great stuff. And I also think it's very important to call out here is any of us wanted to get rich quick, we wouldn't start with open source either, right? Today, that's like we're not 100%. Here to get rich or famous. We're here to do good, right? And what that means and how we do it, that's the discussion. So Chad, to your question of where do I come from in all this? So I started, when we open source Directus and started doing that, it was very much self-subsidized, to use that term again, right? So I was just working an agency job at the same time, and I was sort of able to make enough with that to reserve sort of a day or two a week to focus on the open source project, up until that project got big enough where the maintenance burden became just a full-time job. And then at that point, it became a question of sustainability for me, which is like, okay, I need to make a choice because there's no money coming in and I need to pay my rent. It's just very straightforward transactional at that point, right? Then I'm like, I want to be able to work on this full time. I know there's big companies using this because I did see, the issues coming in and some emails for support requests and all that kind of stuff. Then the question just becomes, okay, how do we turn this into a thing that generates just about enough revenue to make it sustainable? And that's kind of where the term comes from for me, first and foremost, right? And then over the years, that has just happened again and again, which is like, okay, now it's big enough where it became a 2-person job to maintain, and now a 10-person job to maintain, and how do you grow from there? Is where I'm coming from.
So forgive me, I need to understand a little more. Tell me more about Directus. Directus is a headless CMS background for every custom build. It's an open source project.
Started as. So we have since we switched over to a BSL-based license with delayed open source in 2022.
Yeah.
We chatted briefly about it, funnily enough.
I was going to say, yeah. We but not in person. We were on GitHub.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Civil
connecting.
Maybe it's a good opportunity actually to point out, because also Sentry is fair source, right? That's what
true.
you call it as well. So maybe it's a good point to describe what for example, business source license means.
Is it good to do an introduction round, but licenses? Because I think we have 3 different approaches to solve the same.
Let's do that. That's perfect.
So the same order. So Daniel, you want to go first?
Same order? Okay.
So Nuxt is MIT license, which is basically you can do whatever you want with it. Only we're not responsible if anything goes wrong. It's a common license used. It's very, very open license. People can build businesses on top. There's no obligation involved. No rights are reserved, I guess, other than the moral right to assert ownership and copyright over something. and for the license to be passed on. So people can
Attribution,
use it
right?
Attribution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I would add to that is probably the open source license. Is that fair to say? It's like the most common one. I mean, there's many, of course, that fit the definition, but I think when people think of open source, that at least I would argue MIT is sort of what you're thinking of when you say free open
Interesting.
source.
Not
Is that-
GPL. Not
well, that's
GPL.
kind of why I phrased it like
Right.
this. Like I'm
So-
like nowadays, if you start a new thing, is MIT the going sort of thought?
Yes. So exactly, because I think it used to be GPL.
Right.
GPL used to be what you thought of, this sort of viral open source that sort of is, because there was this sort of movement, like this big question, Stallman and the sort of the Free Software Foundation and, open as in, like, what kind of open source are you talking about? Free as in beer or free as in speech. Yeah, exactly. So like, yeah, what are you talking about? But now I don't actually see that people are licensing software primarily looking at something like the GPL. I think people are. I might be wrong. Maybe it's the circles I'm in, but I don't see people.
That's literally why I asked it too, because I'm in the sort of especially JavaScript ecosystem. I want to say a lot of the libraries sort of default to MIT.
Yeah,
and I think
definitely in the JavaScript ecosystem.
And I think there will be a very interesting discussion about where the difference is in libraries versus products and how that comes to. But
absolutely.
well, let's circle back to that.
But also, I would add to that probably, especially in the web development ecosystem or like the front end party, so JavaScript, TypeScript, a lot of libraries, frameworks, and so on would probably not be as popular if they would be like GPL licensed compared to MIT. At least that my
And I think there's a
hot
big
take.
library versus product thing there. Anyways, but before we get too derailed there, Chad, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah. So coming from Sentry, so Sentry started life as an unlicensed side project in 2008. A year later, it went under the BSD 3-clause license, which is like MIT. It's a permissive license, we call it. Permissive versus copyleft, right? So permissive is like MIT, Apache, BSD. Copyleft is the term we use for GPL, AGPL, those kind of share-alike licenses. So BSD, and then in 2019, we were one of these companies that relicensed. So like MongoDB did this, Elastic, Cockroach, HashiCorp, Redis more recently. And so Sentry relicensed in 2019 to the business source license, the BSL that you referred to a minute ago. Then in 2023, we wrote our own license called the functional source license, FSL, which is kind of a cleanup of the business source license. And then we launched a new brand called Fair Source to kind of disambiguate from open source and to be like, okay, this is not open source software. What is it? We have our own values kind of behind this that are driving us to do this. Let's start to, gather together like-minded companies that are in this boat with us. Fair Source is our effort to do that. So FSL is our license. Fair Source is the type of license that it is. It's not open source, it's fair source, which basically is like for a company's core product. And the restriction in fair source licensing, what we were just saying a minute ago about restrictions in permissive open source, the only restriction is attribution. It's like you can take this code, you can do whatever you want with it. There's a whole other thing about trademarks, maybe not muddy this too much, but you have to attribute. So actually, we might come back to this. If you open up your phone, you guys ever do this? You open up your phone and you go into settings and you go into legal. In your phone, there's pages and pages and pages. I like the scrolling there, right? Like pages and pages of licenses for all of the components that Google or Apple are using to deliver the software on your phone. Okay, so attribution is there with permissive, and with fair source, the restriction is really around compete. So for Sentry, we say, hey, you can download this software, you can run it yourself, you can self-host. We're not going to monetize self-hosted. We only monetize SaaS. So go ahead and run it yourself. If you want to give us some patches, we'll take them into consideration. But we're primarily building the thing ourselves. Like we own the roadmap, we own the product. We're building this, and you can run it yourself as long as you don't compete with us. So you can't stand up a competing SaaS and sell Sentry to people. That's the limitation, and so that's fair source.
With the important addition that it's also delayed open source.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So BSL and FSL and fair source is part of the core definition of fair source. Then, yeah, exactly. Delayed open source. So our software Sentry in the FSL, after 2 years, the software goes under either MIT or Apache. Is the way the FSL works.
Oh, that's a good addition. Yeah.
No, I think
Yeah,
it's very
fair
important
enough.
to
Sorry,
call
thanks for
out in
bringing that up.
this whole discussion is that for
Appreciate it.
both what Sentry is doing, what we're doing as well, which is there's very closely aligned. It is that we want to be as open source as we possibly can, but you need some sort of exclusivity window, if you will, right? You see it in the video game
Yep.
industry all the time, but that's kind of how I compare it. It's like we have just a window of exclusivity in which there is some sort of way to monetize some of it somehow, and then
Yeah.
it becomes fully permissively open source after a certain window.
So this gets us right back to market economy versus gift economy, because in a market economy, you have to have scarcity. Scarcity is the thing that makes a market economy function, because there's that hard requirement that it's like, well, I'm not going to give you the thing. The robot's not going to let me walk away with the M&Ms until I give it the money, right? There's this scarcity that drives a market economy. And so to have any kind of business, to have any business model, you have to withhold something. You have to have something scarce that you're only giving, after you've received the money or in view of the transaction, versus a gift economy, which, has a different dynamic.
Mm-hmm. And then to finish that round of intros, so Directus as a project started GPL, copy left. And the main intent there was to make sure that if a company would make a fork and make it super better for whatever reason, I wanted to make sure that that remained accessible to the bigger ecosystem as well. And that was really the main differentiator for us to go with GPL over an MIT. There was lots of questions around what does that mean for a plugin ecosystem, and it got a bit hairy in that because there's so much gray area when it comes to copy left like that. We switched to the BSL primarily. We were also one of those companies in 2022. The primary reason for that was that we tried to do a sort of, we offer it as a SaaS on the side to subsidize the project, but it is self-hosted software at its core, right? And then we realized that we tried it for a bit as donation where it didn't generate enough. We tried it for a bit as make the SaaS a premium version of the open source thing. That was just against the core of the platform because it is self-hosted software at its core. And then we realized over time that the real contributions that we saw the most was from individuals and smaller companies investing their own free time, whereas most of the value that people got out of it happened at the giant companies that we didn't really see much back from. Shout out to the open source pledge, by the way, Chad. I know you guys have been doing great work there too. So what we adopted now was the BSL license. And the main difference there between GPL and BSL, it is a delayed open source thing as well. So it goes back to GPL after, I think we set it at 3 years instead of the 4 by default. And what the BSL license basically says is you can use it for non-production, do whatever you want. And then for production, you need to get some sort of commercial license from the owner of the platform. The BSL, however, has a sort of escape hatch for project owners in the additional usage grant. And this is where it gets a bit different because every BSL project is different, unfortunately. And in our additional usage grant, we said, okay, if you are an individual or a company below a revenue threshold, you use it for free in production as well. And that was basically a way to try to balance those skills a bit, that we don't sort of needlessly double extract from the people that are already contributing back. But we do enforce larger companies that weren't contributing before to contribute financially and therefore make the project sustainable. That has worked relatively well, but it's one of those things where there's still, I mean, that's why I'm so excited about this chat, because there's so many things in flux and so many attempts at solving this problem from different angles. I think the important difference though, Chet, and this is why we had an interesting chat about this, is the whole, because we are sort of self-hosted first, it changes the dynamic a bit. We don't really care about non-competes, because if you want to run your own SaaS that offers Directus, then that is a good thing. Like we want to encourage that instead of prevent it. And so therefore it's been a very interesting time to sort of follow along with what you guys are doing with FAIR and some of these other licensing models.
Yeah, and I'm reviewing our GitHub thread as well from a little bit ago. It looks like that was last August. And I'm remembering now, because we also have the FAIR core license under FSL, which has a provision in there for self-hosting, basically a license key option, so that companies that do have a business model where they're monetizing self-hosted have that option in there. So
with the one tricky bit there, we're getting super into the weeds, folks.
Yeah, exactly, we are. But GPL, I think, was an issue.
Well, that even
because you wanted
that,
to go to GPL.
I'm more than happy to sort of revisit that, what it converts into. But it's the main issue was around the permitted internal use clause, because we are sort of like a backend data platform intended to become your internal backend for data. You could easily see that as internal use and therefore nothing could be monetized. So it
Okay,
gets,
so
it gets
let's zoom
interesting.
out though.
Yeah,
Let's zoom out though, because this is about open source sustainability.
For sure.
And certainly at Sentry, what we're saying is like, we're not open source. Sentry is no longer, like we were open source. And for a long time after we relicensed, we tried to actually, when I joined the company, I joined a year after the relicensing. So relicensed in 2019. I joined in 2020. And I was like, I'm joining an open source company with an open source product. And then I got in, it was like, oh, it's actually BSL. And then like, found out that there was this whole, like, we tried to be like, no, we're open source too, you know, and they're like, no, you're not. Like, it's BSL. BSL is not an open source license. And it took us a while to kind of admit that, but now we do. Sentry is not an open source product. Sentry is not, you know, in that term, an open source company. Now we do, you know, we love open source and we use other open source, and we, you know, obviously are trying to fund open source in a fair way and do all this stuff. But Sentry, the product, is fair source. It's not open source. This call is about open, per definition, is about open source sustainability. So, you know, I think all of the fair source stuff I think is interesting. I kind of want to set that over here and get back to Daniel. Nuxt is an MIT project. That's a true open source license, right? What can you tell us a little more about? I mean, Nuxt Labs, what's their business model? How does that work? They're not fair sources. It's open source.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just before that, and it's very interesting that you sort of came out so strongly to say that Sentry is not open source. I would be very interested to know if Rijk would say that Directus is open source. And the question that I would like pose or think is an interesting one is, if open source is about the gift economy, what is being given? Like, what is the thing that is being given in an open source project? Because, for example, you could have an open source project. So you could say like the code is being given. But there are also some other things that some open source projects have and that matter, like direction, feedback, contributions, the opportunity to be part of the project. So you can, for example, have one project which is open source. You can see it, you can take it, you can fork it, but you cannot contribute to the vision because actually the vision is totally set. Some other organization or person, and you're just, this isn't an open project, it's just code that's open. You can also imagine projects which actually, the source is open, but it's also very much a community project, and the direction and feedback and development is a very open thing as well. So I think there's a question there of in any kind of open source project, like what is
it? Oh, and to your point, we and I personally have struggled with that a lot because we were in the same boat that it was like, okay, we have to switch to this BSL license to make it sustainable. But other than that, we do everything exactly the same as the open source project did before, and we remain that ethos as much as we can continuously, right? So therefore we were too saying for a little bit, well, it's like, yeah, we are an open source company, even though maybe the main product is not, but then we have a bunch of open source packages, and therefore we're still sort of very open in ideology, even if the main thing that people see first and foremost is not. And I think similar to Sentry, we're in a similar boat now that we were also just saying, well, straightforwardly, if you look at the definition, there's 10 points, 2 of which are questionable, if not just not, right? Points 5 and 6, if you want to look it up in the OSI definition specifically, for the main core Directus product. But then at the same time, I do try to ship as many of the building blocks that we build for the product as separate MIT libraries. And therefore, I'm still like, okay, is Directus as a company an open source company? What even is that, right? Does that have to do with company, how you run a business and how do you process feedback? Or is that truly, do you ship stuff according to the definition? So I'm still sort of juggling that a little bit, right? That I'm like, okay, the main product is not, that I agree on, right? Because it's just BSL license, and that it's just not an open source, an OSI definition license. As a company, I still kind of want to say, well, we are an open source group of maintainers in that sense, because we're still doing it the same way we always have, in a very, what you would expect. And this is, again, where assumptions kick in, right? What you would expect from an open source ecosystem.
Yeah, I think the word I would bring in here is governance. You've got code, and then you've got governance, you know, so what's the governance of the project? Who owns the trademark? What's that entity? Is it a nonprofit foundation? You know, is it a single individual? Is it a for-profit company? And who's got, you know, the admin bit on the repo? You know, again, is it a nonprofit foundation? Is it, an individual? Is it a for-profit company?
And
we don't. And the thing is, like, that has not. We keep sort of dancing. Maybe we should kind of unpack this open source definition we've referred to a few times, and maybe say a word about the OSI. Is that a good thing to
Sounds like a good
do
idea
at this point?
Yeah.
So the OSI stands for Open Source Initiative. That is the nonprofit founded in 1998 that launched open source as a movement. So Bruce Perens, Eric Raymond, and I think we're the two founders of that, and others obviously involved. Before that, we were talking about free software. So 98 is when we start talking about open source software. Open Source Initiative is this nonprofit founded to steward this movement under this name, this brand. And the open source definition is a document written by Bruce Perens for the Debian project. It was the Debian free software guidelines that, Bruce was a lawyer, and he wrote this document as part of the Debian social contract. So, the Debian project had the social contract where they say, like, here's what free software means to us, so for a package to be included in the Debian distribution, it has to meet these 10 criteria, the Debian free software guidelines. And so when Bruce and Eric started Open Source Initiative, they just changed the title. They changed it from Debian free software guidelines to open source definition. So it's a 10-point, definition that says a license, any given, we've been talking about these licenses, the MIT license, the GPL license, the Apache license, et cetera. For a license to be OSI approved open source, it has to fit this 10-point definition. So there's a whole license review process. It's been going on for 25 plus years, where, there's a mailing list that people argue about this stuff. And then there's a group that decides, like the OSI decides, well, this license, fits the definition, this one doesn't. And so there's like hundreds of licenses that have gone through this review process. And so that's the open source initiative. That's the open source definition. And so, we can talk about like open source in a broader sense, because the point, I guess, and the reason it came up at this point, it says nothing about governance. It says nothing about governance. Open source definition is only about the copyright of the source code, the licensing of the source code, and says nothing about governance. So there's an ambiguity. There's a question of expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I raise that as an important thing is also because the reason that open source takes over the world is because it's easy to adopt. And so people adopt open source because it de-risks you. One of the things is it de-risks you. So if something goes wrong, you can take the code, use it, change it. You can do things. Also, you're not embarking on this on your own. You can contribute back, but other people contribute too. Like, you're part of a movement. There's safety in numbers. There's safety and openness, right? So all of that de-risking is a positive thing. And you can also benefit from a lot of that, even if it's not technically open source. So like, I imagine I'm using Sentry, I'm using Directus, even if we're saying, hey, this isn't technically open source, I can still, if I encounter a bug, I can also I can fix it. And, obviously there'll be people who are paid to do that. But if I fix it, then I prioritize my need and I fix the bug that I'm facing. Mm-hmm. I solve my own problem. I help other people. And it might technically not be open source, but it has a lot of the reason that I might want to use an open source project as well. Like a lot of the same benefits in some cases.
There's a lot of benefit. There's a lot of value. What you don't have is the ability to start a company on that same project. You couldn't start a company. We talk about single vendor and multi-vendor. So there's these folks doing is single vendor open source, where it's like technically an open source, like open core is part of this, or like commercial open source. So like Calcom or Plausible or GitLab, they use the AGPL license, which is the most viral of the licenses. And it's a defensive maneuver, because they're saying, so we use AGPL, so any other company that wants to come anywhere near this code is going to have to be even, as they're going to have to share alike. Okay. But they pair that with what's called a contributor licensing agreement, a CLA. So I'm a Plausible user, and I have a pull request in Plausible because it's just like you're saying, Daniel. I was using this product, there was something, an improvement I wanted to make, and because it was open, I was able, it was on GitHub, so I gave them a pull request and they accepted it, and that's in there now. And this was actually before, when it was new enough they didn't have the CLA. But if I did that now, I'd have to sign this contributor licensing agreement that basically gives them rights to use my contribution however they want. Okay. And what that means is that they're a single vendor commercial open source project. And, so it's a little bit of a gray area between, a company and an open multi-vendor commercial. Like, think about Linux, like is the classic example. You've got, Red Hat and IBM and Huawei and Google and Microsoft, like everybody's contributing to Linux. There's no one vendor that has a lock. And that is kind of, I don't know, to me, like, I want that to be open source. I want to call that open source.
But yet it's very much
controversial?
a BDFL project in governance structure.
Linux is.
Yeah. So it is kind of funny how you're saying it's multi-vendor, but at the same time, there's one person with the final keys, right?
Yeah.
The final
Yeah.
keys.
I mean, Apache is the best at the more democratic processes. Yeah. So that's another question, right? Is who owns the roadmap?
It's a very interesting question, and I mean I really think that there are benefits to, like, I can see the benefits on both sides. So there are benefits to company, like situations like Node, which has like there's committees, like there's people,
Right.
there's people, and there are other projects as well which have a similar kind of thing. There's a foundation, there's governance, there's all of this. It safeguards things, it keeps them stable for the future, but on the other hand, it also slows them down. It can have an effect of friction. So it's a lot harder for things to move forward in some cases. I remember I saw when Node was looking to get a Blue Sky handle, for example. Actually, this wasn't just a simple, who's going to do it? How are things going to be approved? Like, this was and then you look at little upstart projects like Bun, for example, or Dino, and then they have it's very much a case of whatever we want to do, we can do. And so this is it's always going to be a trade-off.
Yeah, but does that distinction between the project governance and scale and size, does that bear on this question of what's the definition of open source?
No.
Does Bun or Dino, because they're small and more agile, is that more genuinely open source than Node? I don't think it does.
It doesn't, but should it?
I don't think it should.
It's the question of sustainability, because when you came, so I mean, Bun and Dino are just examples, but you could pick any project with a BDFL. A BDFL approach to governance.
So, sorry, maybe quick for the listener. BDFL.
Yeah,
it's awful. It's terrible. So, like,
what is a BDFL?
BDFL.
What is BDFL?
BDFL. It stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life.
And it comes from the Python community. Guido van Rossum was Barry Warsaw, I believe it was, jokingly referred to Guido as the benevolent dictator for life of the Python project back in the late 90s.
You have to take it in a humorous way, because like the concept of a dictator is very unpleasant. I can't just say. I don't. So at some point we have a Nuxt governance document. And I went through it before I stepped on as the lead of the team. I went through it and tried to remove as much of the dictator language as possible from it, because it's so unpleasant and doesn't describe dynamics that actually I would want to be happening in a project I was involved in.
What did you replace it with, Daniel?
Well, I can. That's available
Supreme Leader.
Ooh, difficult.
I mean,
president,
chief executive officer.
Chief executive,
I mean, what?
Yeah.
It's open source. It's open source. I talk about our governance document is open source on Nuxt/governance.
Sure.
Link in the show notes for everyone.
Did you just search replace the word for another word, or it was more complicated than that?
I pretty much rewrote this. So rewrote the document. So it doesn't talk about, so it doesn't really talk anymore about, but there are several things, because one is I'm not the BDFL, even in those terms, because in the Nuxt situation, I didn't create Nuxt. So I stepped on as a project lead. So I'm effectively a CEO. If you know the distinction, like that, I know you do, but like if you imagine the distinction between a board of directors and a CEO, someone who's responsible for the day-to-day running, and direction, but is still accountable to. So the original project authors, people like Sebastian Chopin, Alexander Chopin, the Chopin brothers, and also Puya Parsa, who is very influential. They sort of retain this sort of overseer role. So I can be fired, like I can be got rid of. I'm not a for life situation. But at the same time, I am a benevolent dictator because unless that happens, I do set the direction of the project.
Yeah.
And actually, I really, really like that as a sense of checks and balances, because it's like when you have someone who's making the day-to-day decisions but also has no check on them at all, then I think like that could produce unhealthy dynamics. It doesn't.
I like that. I like
necessarily,
that.
but-
Not like we see that in the world right now, right? So,
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wrong podcast.
Yeah, wrong podcast. Well, I'll tell you what, though. This is the thing about open source. I mean, you're saying it's kind of a special episode. You know, usually, like, we get into open source because we love the tech. You know, we love building websites and we love geeking out on tech together. But open source, you start pulling on those threads, and it gets into politics. It gets into economics, and you know, to my mind, it like. Open source, we have huge things to say to the rest of the world. And like, we're so disorganized and like, you know, like fighting about petty little things. And it's like, there's so much potential in open source to heal the world is how I think of it. Like, if we could get our act together and get organized and see clearly and like, we have a gift to offer. And I really like where you're going with this, like BDFL. Yeah, it was cute in the 90s, you know, and like, okay, so let's find what's genuine there and maybe get serious about reframing it, because like, we're not kids anymore, quote unquote. It's like open source. The European Union has now written open source into like its foundational structure of their economy. Like they invented a new economic category for open source software stewards. Do you know this? Are we aware of this?
yes.
Heard about it.
The
I'm living in
CRA?
the EU, so
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but like the CRA, which stands for the Cyber Resiliency Act, is like, in order to get that done, they had to invent a new category. So you have market producers, and then you have consumers. Okay. So there's all this like consumer protection law in the EU that's based on, okay, so we got producers and consumers. And then, you know, when they went to regulate software, the open source community is like, hold on, you know, like we're not a traditional producer like you're used to. And Brussels had to carve out a definition, open source software steward. So point being, open source has arrived. Like the pill has been swallowed, you know, like, all modern digital infrastructure is built on top of open source. And we need to get serious about figuring out the implications of that. Like, so this BDFL idea, I really like what you're saying, that, you know, okay, cute thing from the past. What's genuine there is like, we need like there, you know, I'm going to introduce a word here, hierarchy. Like there's hierarchy in projects, whether we like it or not. Okay. So let's have the best hierarchy we can. I like where you're going with the model, which is evolutionarily stable, because we see it all over the place. Like in companies or in nonprofits, you have a board and then you have a director, you have a board and you have a chief executive, you know, so is that a model that open source projects can do more of?
I guess especially also depending on the size. So that's also like, I don't know, Nuxt, of course, is a project that's not quite small, so to say. For like, if you are a solo dev putting out things, there's of course a whole different story, because then
you are the whole hierarchy by yourself.
Exactly. You are everything.
Exactly.
You're doing the whole thing. But then it starts with like, okay, if you get like, at some point, there is enough work for more than 2 times you. So what happens then? Like you get contributors on, but then how do you formalize them? You just say like, hey, here's a team, everybody come on and join. What happens is then a lot of people join, and then it starts with, okay, you have to in some way structure things, right? And that can lead to a hierarchy, or at least a way to structure open source projects. So I wonder, have you, I mean, of course you have, but have you experience in terms of structuring that, like building up a team and maybe an advice for people, maybe in open source, saying, okay, I want to get on more contributors. How is like, what's the best way, quote unquote, or like a good way to do that?
So the question sounds twofold, right? Is one, how do you grow a team and then put hierarchy in? And the other question is a bit broader, of how do you get more contributors? Is that right?
True. I think the first part is, at least to me personally, the more interesting one, because contributors, it's also like, it's a whole different angle. Let's maybe focus on the first part of like, okay, you have people want to join.
Yeah.
How do we structure it at the best way?
So I think for me personally, you know, you started, it's the same thing. You're a hierarchy of 1 or a hierarchy of 2, right? Because you just have the original founders and the original starters of a project. Then the first couple contributors that start Well, there's also the big difference between sort of one-off drive-by PRs or just one-off fixes and things, and people that sort of start to recurrently contribute things. And at those stages, it's still fairly clear because you have one or two folks with the keys, and they are the ones shipping everything and clicking the merge button. Once you get to a point where you trust somebody enough to give them the keys to the castle, so to speak, to start shipping things, then it becomes interesting immediately, because then you get into a point where, in my experience, there's a sort of hidden assumption that the original founders have final say in the matter, and then you end up in a sort of structure that Daniel just described. And at a certain point, you also have to just start highlighting, okay, who has the most expertise in certain areas of the thing that you're building as well. So in the case of Directus, I'm sure Sentry has the same, of course, because it is a more of a product rather than a one-off library that has one focus. It's a product that's meant to be doing a lot of different things, means that you end up with people that know more about certain aspects of it than just the whole picture, right? And then the question becomes, okay, I might be floating on top as the sort of original, BDFL person, but at the same time, I don't have the expertise over everything anymore, right? So at what point do you codify that, or do you at least acknowledge that if one of my team members that has been, hyper focused on one product area for a long time says something, what wins out, right? Is it just going to be my gut feeling again as this BDFL? Probably shouldn't be. Is that something that's codified? In our case, not. We don't have this documented, right? I have documented what our sort of decision-making process is to try to keep that as transparent as possible, but I didn't write down, which I will, by the way, after this call. I will definitely fork. I hope the governance doc is licensed MIT. But yeah, I haven't.
We'll link the new
that.
one.
Yeah,
we'll link the new one in show notes.
Yeah.
But I mean, the questions you're getting into, though, are questions of authority, responsibility, control, which are true of any organization.
Power.
For sure. Yeah.
Power. Yeah.
Sure.
So because the degree to which you're willing to delegate authority or power and basically say to someone, you can do this thing, I think is hugely, it affects, like, it's a question of what kind of a leader are you and how good are you at being a leader. I see good leaders as people, I see that good leaders do delegate authority. I think you often see bad leaders delegating responsibility.
Ooh,
But not,
well put.
but not authority. I'm sure we've all been in a situation where we have responsibility for something
without authority,
but we don't have the ability to make it happen. So we don't have the authority, but we do have the responsibility. And that is it's an awful situation to be in.
Do you all want an anecdote about open source leadership? A lesson in open source leadership that I learned?
Yes.
So the year was 2012, 2013 maybe. And the city was Montreal. The Python conference was happening in Montreal. And I was invited to go out to dinner with there were 5 of us. We were going out to dinner in the old city in Montreal. It's like very romantic, stone streets and narrow walkways. We were going to this like fancy French restaurant. It was myself and 3 others, and Guido, Ben Rossum, was part of the group. So I went out to dinner with Guido. I had this like romantic dinner, like we were sitting across from each other in this like romantic date restaurant, like sharing a dessert and everything. It was like this wonderful memory. It was kind of hilarious. But the story I want to tell is we left the hotel and started walking and realized that like we didn't actually know where we were going. So there's like, 5 geeks wandering around, Old Town Montreal, like trying to find a restaurant. And Guido stood behind me and said, "I'll go wherever you're going." And I was like, "Oh," so like that's always stuck with me as an example of open source leadership. Like here's this person who clearly I looked up to, he's like the creator of Python. And I was like getting to go out to dinner with, this, small group with Guido. And yeah, for him to like stand behind me and be like, the delegation, right? The delegation of responsibility and authority. And yeah, and he was like the willingness of the leader to become the follower in that situation was really, I don't know, something that stuck with me. Yeah. There's a lot here about leadership.
True that. One important question though. Did you find a good restaurant? Was everyone happy?
What was the restaurant?
We did. Yeah, it was this like great French restaurant. So it was like, imagine the 5 of us geeks and like every other table was like a table for 2 with like, a candle and a rose. And it was like the 5 of us kind of, a little out of place there. But yeah, it was a really fun time. Yeah. Shout out to Kenneth Wrights for organizing that one. But Yeah, there's so much here. I actually do have to wind down. This conversation's going so great. I have to start preparing for my next call. But I like this idea that open source leadership, power, economics. What kind of economy is it? I love this conversation. I wish I didn't have to leave. This is great.
We can do it anytime again.
We're just going to gather. Can I propose Edinburgh? It's a lovely place, some nice pubs, good whiskey, lots of chance for chat in front of a fire, something like that.
My friend Vlad, that works on the open source pledge with us, is doing a PhD in the economics of exploitation at Edinburgh. So, and he's working on the open source pledge with us. So
all the dots are aligning. So
exactly.
Yeah. I'm in.
Cool.
Then maybe let's end it in a nice call to action way. Michael, you have prepared something that everybody out there who's interested in open source, like a developer, might be useful for them, at least depending on the answers for our panelists here.
Yeah. So for our listeners, are there any key actions or next steps that someone can do, maybe today, maybe in the next hour, to help open source with sustainability, whether it's financial? That's the obvious one that comes to mind a lot, but it's not just financial, as we have discussed. It's a whole bunch of things. So from your perspective, what is like a simple thing that people can do to help with the sustainability?
We got our canonical order, Daniel.
I think there's so many little things. I wrote a blog post on contributing to Nuxt, which I think sums up some of them. I think what is going to keep me going is enjoying what I'm doing. And I enjoy what I'm doing when people are kind to other people in the community, when people help other people out, when people contribute. Open source is coding with friends. It's a lot of fun. And the thing that's going to keep me going is when that carries on. I would also love to see people on my core team, like Alex and others, be sponsored, because it enables them to keep going with open source. It enables that continued coding with fun with friends. So that is the kind of thing I would love to see. So please sponsor Alex, Julian, Harlan, Anthony, Lucy, Puya, Sebastian. A lot of people. I would love to see that. But yeah, just keep the community being a fun place to be.
And when you convince your company to sponsor the maintainers of Nuxt and all of the other open source maintainers that you depend on, check out the open source pledge. OpenSourcePledge.com is an initiative that we launched at Sentry 6 months ago. And now we've got 32 companies on board that over the past year collectively have given over $2.5 million to open source maintainers, to paid maintainers. So yeah, this is an effort to really change the status quo in companies funding open source. So opensourcepledge.com. If you're a decision maker at a company, we would love to have you on board. If you're a developer and you don't necessarily control the budget, definitely start having that conversation internally would be great. But really, I would say as a developer, open source, we're going to come back to this in Edinburgh, Daniel. This question of obligation in open source. I actually don't want to use that word obligation or expectation, but invitation. The invitation with open source is like you receive a gift. There's an invitation to freely reciprocate. We want that joy that Dan was talking about. We want that, freedom, but it's an invitation. So the invitation is, if you're using an open source project and you find a bug in it, it actually is really valuable to write a high quality bug report. If you can take half an hour out of your week to make a small contribution to open source, to fix some documentation, to provide a reproduction for a bug report, if all of us do a little bit, it helps everybody else, and that's really the heart of open source. Friends coding together. Sure. How many friends can we get here? So
for sure. Yeah, I was going to summarize that as a lot of projects are a collaborative effort, or they're a product of passion and love. And let's not forget that across the board, that it's like you find something on the internet you use, fantastic, go for it, go nuts. Somebody did that just out of selflessness and out of fun and joy, and let's keep the fun and joy in there.
Perfect.
Love it.
I want to add one last thing, which is not even strictly related to open source, but helps a lot in all kinds of ecosystems. Content create some content around it. It doesn't have to be crazy high, like podcasts or YouTube videos, blog posts. Like, hey, I use this tool, I solved something. There you go. You solve it anyway. Take the time to write it up so you don't forget it for later and people looking for it as well.
A contribution is so much more than a PR, right?
100%.
Anything that helps an ecosystem out in any way is a meaningful contribution.
I think these are perfect words to end this episode, folks. Thank you so much for coming on, and we have to do it again in Edinburgh, but also maybe here again. Let's see.
Let's do it.
Thanks, everybody. Of course, make sure to follow Daniel, Chad, and Rijk, the socials, and links to everything mentioned in the show notes or YouTube description. Thank you so much for coming on. Check out the older DejaVue episode, or if this is not the latest one, then, well, just continue listening. Thanks, everybody.
Alex, Michael, thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Daniel, Rijk, yeah. All right, cheers.
Thanks for coming on.